Hey everyone. So I'm going to talk today about something that I've been interested in for a while, small towns and how they're too often erased from how we visualize US presidential elections. So I'm going to talk through this in three parts. First, a bit more about my long held belief that small towns vote differently than their surrounding counties. Then, what I found when I actually tested this hypothesis in Ohio, that indeed there is a 10 percentage point difference between small towns and rural areas in the 2020 election. And I'll wrap up with some ideas for how to better take advantage of the incredibly detailed data that we do have to better represent geographical nuance at the regional and national scale. So at this point, I don't think we really need to say too much more about the problems with counties. You've likely heard about them. Counties are large, and in the western US, they're huge. San Bernardino County is one of the worst offenders here. It's nearly all desert, with all its population in one very small corner of the county. These are very different places. To give an example from my own county, Portage County in Ohio, my city of Kent has far more in common with the suburbs of Akron and Akron itself than it does with the wide open spaces in the rest of the county. So the result is that there are big differences between places and counties. This chat shows the variations in life expectancy in New York counties when you divide the counties up by census tract. The lived experience from city to city, from neighborhood to neighborhood, is far more nuanced than county averages allow us to see. So, this brings us to small towns and rural areas. Media narratives of the 2016 and 2020 elections conflated these two categories. But when I actually looked at these supposedly quote, turned Trump small towns, some of them were actually blue and not red. This is the example of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Now, I never had any pretensions that all small towns supported Biden or Clinton. And spoiler alert, when I actually looked at the data, they didn't. I did think, though, that a closer look at outcomes in these places versus surrounding areas was needed. So, how to find out if my hypothesis was true? I've worked for quite a while with definitional issues of small towns versus rural areas versus cities versus suburbs. The short version, and I'm happy to answer questions, more questions about this in Slack or elsewhere, but the short version is that I'm using US Census definitions that are based on population density. So having census block level outlines of these small towns, I can then join them to fine scale data about other topics and extract the small towns and separate their data from not small town areas, the rural areas, but also I separated out suburbs and cities larger than 50,000. So this process turned out to be much more labor intensive than I expected it to be. So I ended up sticking with just looking at the somewhat swing statey state of Ohio and identified voting precincts that fit into the small town, suburb, large city, and rural area categories. The data showed a significant difference between small towns and rural areas. Most of them are still red, but they're definitely less Republican than rural areas. You can see that the rural areas kind of cancel out the traditionally Democratic cities. Suburbs are split 50-50, and then there's small towns, a smaller number in terms of population, but still, I don't want to ignore them. A key finding here was that in nearly all of Ohio's 88 counties, small towns were less Republican than the rest of the surrounding county. The greatest differences were in college towns, not surprisingly, and the three counties where the small towns were actually more Republican than the surrounding areas of the county were urban counties, where rural areas actually ended up behaving more like suburbs, which tended to have closer to a 50-50 split between parties. So I'll share this graphic in the chat or in Slack if you want to see it up close and be able to zoom in and actually read those words. But basically, the black dots are small towns and the gray dots are rural areas. And the horizontal lines between these dots represent the gaps within the same county between voting patterns in each of these two settlement types. I also added in cities and suburbs as triangles and squares. The hollow dot is the county average. So there's no particular geographic pattern to the size of the rural urban divide, but as I mentioned previously, some of the counties with the largest differences were the ones that are home to colleges, including Ohio University in Athens, Oberlin, and Bowling Green. The Black counties here are the ones that don't have either small towns or rural areas to compare. And now here's the hard part. So, what to do? I don't see county based mapping going away anytime soon. Despite large differences within counties, this is how some data is reported. So, for example, COVID data often comes from county health departments. But on the other hand, we live in an age of big data. We often do have these detailed data at our fingertips and in our GIS. So I played around a bit using proportional symbols because, of course, we also need to account for the land doesn't vote issue. And in many cases, the small town populations in these counties, while denser, is often a little bit smaller than the more dispersed rural areas in the county. That said, there's also a clear division between these places of smaller population and the suburbs and larger cities that are part of what makes Ohio almost a swing state. But in the end, I come back to this dot density map that I made earlier this year, before I actually ran the numbers in terms of the differences between small towns and rural areas. And I was really just trying to visualize the detailed precinct level data that's available for most states following the 2020 election. A closer look at this map, which again, I'll post in Slack to make sure that you see the detail, but a closer look at this illustrates the real differences between high density places and low density places in terms of their voting patterns. This certainly reflects nuance far better than a county average map. And that's important, right? Last week, I made a series of dot density maps for a workshop on gerrymandering, boundaries, race, and democracy. These small details, the small, detailed, geographic, nuanced areas, in this case, we're down to this, right down to the census block level, they really become important as politicians try to work lines around areas to manipulate voting outcomes. So dot density maps are one way to show more nuance. There are many other approaches too. I'm just hoping to see more geographical nuance in the future. Thanks, and feel free to contact me with questions and ideas.